Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new episode on our Open to Happiness podcast. I am your host, Nicoletta, and today I will be joined by Naomi Murphy, clinical and forensic psychologist, the host of the Locked Up Living podcast, and honorary professor of psychology at Nottingham Trent University. We will be talking about captivity and happiness today, and I'm really looking forward to explore this topic. Hello, Naomi, and very welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nicoletta. Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's really nice to get the opportunity to explore something as uplifting as happiness.
Thank you for accepting to join me. And I think we need to thank our common friend or acquaintance that introduced one to the other and facilitated in a way or initiated this conversation. Many thanks to her as well. So before we start talking about captivity and happiness, shall we find out a little bit about you? Who are you and how was your journey in life so far?
You straight at the deep end there,
Nicoletta.
Yes. Yes. So I suppose the key to me is I moved a lot as a child, and for me, alongside having a stable family life, was really important for my sense of belonging was my relationship to education. And for me, I got a lot of pleasure from education and learning during childhood, which I carried into my adulthood with me. So I had a very transient life in terms of my childhood, and that's really led me, I guess, to seek out some degree of stability in adulthood, which might be how I later found myself spending 17 years working in a high secure prison. Did my degree in psychology, and I knew that the kind of subjects that really interested me were the ones that were a bit more puzzling, and I had to work harder to understand. And I was always really interested in abnormal psychology and why people might do things that seemed incomprehensible on the face of it, and found myself working in a prison and then training as a clinical psychologist and gravitating towards working with people who are in contact with the criminal justice system. Again, I think trying to make meaning out of things that felt on the surface seemed to be incomprehensible, but actually always did have some meaning when you dug into them.
Yeah, so beautiful. We have a lot in common, in fact, because I've been moved whilst I was little from grandparents to parents. And, I found it quite unsettling, most likely when I was young. But obviously I didn't process it at the time. I wasn't developed enough to understand what's happening. And I kind of found refuge in books, in reading, in trying to just find answers, really. And then the family environment was filled with domestic abuse at times. So again, education has been like a light on my path. It came to guide me in a way somewhere else. And this kind of natural interest in psychopathology, understanding why my father was drinking, why my father was aggressive, why other fathers are different. This curiosity actually led to a degree in psychology and then all of the others that followed. So we have a lot in common, only that I stayed in the civil world. You moved towards criminology.
Well, I think there's some similarities in connection there, perhaps as well, though, in that you're doing a podcast around happiness, which is something that's really uplifting. And I suppose part of my interest in working with people who were involved in the criminal justice system was a wish to look for the good in people. So it's very easy to fall for the stereotypes that you read about an awful offence and think this person's a monster. And I suppose for me, what's been important is to look for the humanity in the person. And in a way, I think you're doing something quite similar with your podcast in terms of focusing on happiness, not just accepting things might have to be dark at times, but looking for the light.
Yeah. So beautiful, indeed. So your training, your finding finding some solace in education, in learning. How was your relationship with happiness? When you look back now, what do you see?
I don't think my teenage years were very happy. I think that sense of constantly being dislocated from things that were familiar. So, like I said, lucky that I had a loving, stable family, but actually that sense of belonging, when you enter your adolescence, you look more to your peer group for belonging.
Yeah.
But when you're constantly moving, I always had the wrong version of the school uniform, the wrong accent, pronouncing words in different ways, different interests too. So there was something about being, perhaps at times, feeling on the outside, looking in, rather than feeling like really participating in my peer group in the way that might have been more possible with greater stability. So my teenagers weren't particularly happy. I can't say I was really unhappy, but they don't stand out for me as years that I yearn back to. But actually, in terms of, I feel very lucky in terms of how my life's gone. Otherwise, I haven't necessarily done things at the right time, if you like. So I became a mother at 40, for instance, which is quite late to become a mother,
based on the society's rules.
Yes, absolutely. But actually, I've been very, very fortunate that things generally have turned out well for me. And actually, even when things don't go so well, for me, it's important to try and take the growth out of it and try and, what's the meaning of this and how can I turn this into something that is useful. A really good friend said to me one time, sometimes the best gifts come in really shit wrapping paper. And that's a fantastic phrase, I think, because actually things do, in my experience, things have generally worked out well for me by looking at how can I make this an opportunity, rather than feel sorry for myself or feel like this is not working out too well.
What a wonderful perspective to life, extracting meaning from everything and finding a little bit of purpose in everything that's going on. So if you look back now, before we start talking about captivity and oppression and restriction and different other things that are so natural to life, what is happiness to you today?
I think probably there's a few things that add to that. I think definitely safety. So having a sense of safety, and I think obviously connection and belonging is a real key part to that. So having really good friendships, a lovely son, really, really good people around me that I feel connected to. So all of that's really important. But I suppose that could all, people could end up yearning for something more. And I think what I like alongside that is sometimes a sense of the unknown adds some excitement to that picture, and I really draw from that in terms of learning. Adds to happiness. I think that sense of learning something new, there's something exciting that gets fired up in me when I learn something new. And also I'm really drawn to emotion, things that are to do with emotion, so things that evoke kind of like passion of any sort. So if I go to watch a movie, I like to see something that pulls something, whether it be a horror film that makes me feel frightened, a movie that makes me feel really sad, or something that makes me feel really uplifted. All of those things, I think, are having a balance of emotion, because emotion, I think, is kind of like the colour of life. And to feel the happiness, you have to be able to feel some of the other stuff as well, right? Because otherwise, what is happiness? It just becomes something that's bland and neutral. Whereas I think having happiness juxtaposed alongside fear, sadness, shame, sometimes maybe disgust, that to me serves to highlight the happiness more and extenuate it.
Tell us a little bit about your work. How has it been for you to remain open, to be very curious and want to capture as much as you can from life? stay in a way somehow open to vibration, to everything that's going on around, and at the same time working for a long time within a prison unit. What has been like for you to do this work?
Oh, well, where do I start? So I suppose probably worth saying that I worked for 16 to 17 years in a high secure prison with people who were convicted of very serious offences, mainly rape and murder. And so there is something obviously about that can be very, very frightening. And I suppose what was offered to me was the challenge of the population were people who were identified, if for want of a better word, as untreatable psychopaths. Mm-hmm. And so they were prevented from participating in any treatment within the prison system because people thought they didn't know how to treat them. They were a behavioural problem.
Yes.
Quite often they were causing massive problems in terms of management inside the prison system, often offended in prison, sometimes very seriously, mm-hmm. Possibly incurred a second life sentence. And so the challenge was to try and develop a treatment program that would touch these men in some way and help them to change and move on, because they were all stuck languishing in the system. Many of them had been in prison for sort of 15, 20 years, still in the high secure prison. And so there was a sense of kind of apprehension, but also excitement, because I genuinely believed at that point that I could offer something, which might sound really arrogant, but I'd worked previously in a hospital with patients who to some degree had been written off as well, and found that it was possible to form connection by trying to understand the world that they inhabited. And I think part of the inability to see people's potential for change was caused by people having relatively healthy upbringings, superimposing their worldview on other people and not really getting to grips with the worldview. So if you understand that somebody's been very harmed during childhood and is very frightened of authority figures, all of a sudden their aggression, their hostility makes sense, because they're trying to do their best to keep safe. So when I was offered the possibility, for me that was like, this is fantastic, a really great opportunity. It was part of the Labour government's dangerous and severe personality disorder project, so there was a lot of funding available, which meant that we could think seriously about what do these people really need, rather than be having to offer 12 sessions of CBT, for instance.
Yes.
So it meant there was possibility. And so we offered a 5-year-long treatment program, which for every man who came to the project, they had 5 years of individual therapy, which is a really long time to work with somebody for a state institution. And as well, they would be allocated to a group and would have numerous group activities. And so you really got the chance to build very deep relationships with people, that sense of connection. It was a residential service, so the men came and they would live with us for 5 years. And then we would see them in different interventions, but our offices were converted prison cells directly above where the prisoners lived. So we would have interactions with the men in prison as we went about our day anyway. So it really had a strong sense of community in this unit. Now, therapy-wise, the men were only really there, many of them, because they felt it was Hobson's choice. They're stuck in the system. The parole board has said that they have to do something to reduce their risk to move on. Some of them were there because they genuinely just wanted to achieve some sense of inner peace and contentment. And they didn't want to be dangerous. This is the thing, people don't want to be dangerous. But sometimes people are frightened to let go of that. But kind of that first 12 months of treatment was really trying to build a relationship, build a bridge to somebody who's been very, very hurt, very brutalized, doesn't have any faith in the potential for other people to be kind or compassionate to them. So the first 12 months of building a relationship with any of the people in prison that I worked with was usually characterized by a lot of hostility, and I've been called all sorts of names, had the most horrendous things said about me. I've never been physically threatened, but I have felt frightened in prison. If somebody who's if somebody who's killed somebody is losing their temper and shouting at you, it's safety behaviours that cause us to feel safe. We might think, well, there's an officer outside, he's not going to do anything to jeopardise his sentence while he's here, but it's your safety behaviours that
Yes.
make you feel safe. It isn't a safe situation, and if you've got nothing to lose, why wouldn't you punch somebody? But actually, I'm talking about violence, but the psychologists didn't face violence there. But sometimes it could feel like there was a potential for that, in a group of 7 or 8 men, and they're all very angry with you and ganging up against you, because it's easier to be frightened and angry with the facilitators than it is
Yes.
to be angry with one of their peers who they might have to encounter somewhere else. So at times it could be really, really frightening, but also, there were times where I also felt totally disgusted, hearing the details of very serious offences, really quite abhorrent, and sometimes very small details being the bits that, I remember hearing about one man talking about making his victim apply lipstick, and to say that she wanted sex with him. And it's those kind of little details which can feel abhorrent and very disgusting. But I've also heard really heartbreaking stories of sadness, to hear about the little boys behind these men that, felt their parents hated them, wanted them dead, to hear about the awful trauma that they survived from their own childhood. Pretty much across the board were stories of physical and sexual emotional abuse, by multiple perpetrators, and that's heartbreaking. But then also witnessed kind of the sense of love that people could offer to one another and compassion. So, running groups, it was quite common. So the first 12 months, they would all hate each other. They were all loners. They didn't want to be in a room together. By year 3, they would typically be talking about this is the first time in their lives they'd ever felt loved and cared for. And that was, there was an interaction between the staff and the prisoners, but also the way that the prisoners related to one another, and extending real kindness to one another, and trying to recognizing they were on a journey together, this 5-year treatment program, and they needed each other to make the group work and to help the group survive. So they needed to help each other get to the end. And then at the end of treatment, these kind of like witnessing the growth from people, these amazing changes that people had made, which was just made you feel really proud of them, but also really, really heartwarming to see this kind of growth. And I think therapy, and in some ways life is like this as well. I think it's a bit like whitewater rafting, that you don't know what you're given tools to get you from A to B, but you don't actually know what way the current's going to be flowing, and where the bends in the river are going to be, and you have to use your gut to figure that out as you're working your way down this river. And to me, that keeps every day fresh and exciting, because you don't know how it's going to go, which is quite different, I think, from when you're running a manualised programme and you know that in week 3 you're going to do this, and in week 15 you will do this other thing. So for me, that sense of not quite knowing what's ahead, having a sense of what you're aiming for but not quite being sure, was something that I really enjoyed about the work.
So you're talking about your belief in humanness. I don't think it's arrogant at all to imagine that you can actually treat the untreatable. I also see beyond all of these, ceilings or barriers or invisible blockages that, are in front of us or around us. I love to break some of them. I have broken some of them throughout my life, and I carry on doing it. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful initiative to really want to get there. I think it's in a way, it's a professional test, or a professional sort of milestone for you, to go further and do something unique, something novel, something that maybe other people haven't done, haven't believed is possible. And I'm so happy to hear you talking about these beautiful results, because I haven't worked obviously in secure units, but I have encountered some people that have been convicted at some point in their past. and I am aware of the hurt that's been passed on to them, the transgenerational trauma that they carry with them through life, and how blocked they are, how insecure they feel in front of the world, and how little they trust people. We don't really see that often, and this is where probably the misconceptions come around, prisoners, because it's less than 1% of the world population that goes into prison. It's very few people. Not everyone knows someone. And then you hear the news, and then you see how it's portrayed in the media, in the literature as well, when you read books, and in the movies and everywhere. So yes, it sounds fantastic, but has it been your story as well, your learning as well, that these people all carry some trauma, all of them? Is it part of their lives?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. I think I think it's quite widely recognised that women in prison have a history of trauma. I think people are quite happy to accept that, but people really struggle with hearing that about men in prison. And in fact, every time I've presented data on the kind of like the histories of the men in the service that I worked in, and somebody, without doubt, someone would always say to me, how do you know they're not lying? And I think if I were to present the same kind of data on women, that question wouldn't be asked. It's like we're reluctant to believe that about men, and you still read, well, a lot of men in prison have a history of trauma, but I have to say I haven't met the man in prison without a history of trauma. And my experience of different levels of secure environment is that the more security, the kind of like the more grotesque the crime, the more brutality the person experienced during childhood. So in the medium secure setting, often found that maybe mum was a bit passive and wasn't a great protector, but she was not actively abusing, for instance, or there was some other key figure that was protective. But as you get into the high secure prison system, you're talking about people who every adult they've had any contact with, any meaningful contact with, has harmed them in some way. So there's no hope to hold on to for them of human beings being able to extend something kind. But I thought it was interesting when you were talking about challenging ceilings and stuff, because I think perhaps part of the foundation for that kind of work, Nicoletta, as a woman, you're kind of like faced with, there are ceilings and things that you can't do, or you're expected to succumb to some degree. I think also in terms of class background, I remember saying at school I wanted to be a lawyer, and the careers advisor said to me, you don't come from a rich family, so there's no point in you doing law at university.
Right.
And so I think there's something then about in adulthood trying to well, I'll define my future, thank you, rather than have it defined for me.
So in a way, what we're talking about in the prison system, it's not like people develop necessarily mental illness and mental health challenges within that kind of system, within that kind of environment. Most of them carry with them already, by the time they arrive there, some sort of condition, some sort of pain and suffering that hasn't been dealt with, right? Do we agree on that?
Absolutely right. I think when you hear their stories, you think, well, wow, if that had been my experience, I'd be an angry person too. And you can kind of see why what they've done makes sense, even if it seemed like it didn't to start off with. And I think there's a misconception about people who attract a label of psychopathy. They're seen as using violence instrumentally, so kind of like just lashing out in a very cold, calculated way without any heat about the emotion. And my experience is there is always a reason there. It's just that they because they try to protect themselves, it's almost like a switch gets flicked and they feel slighted or affronted, and it produces kind of like a cold rage that enables them to do something in quite a calculated way, rather than I think we can all kind of relate to the angry person who lashes out in a temper and smashes something. Might not be what we do, but we can connect with that wish to lash out. Whereas I think people who've been very, very brutalized disconnect from their emotional self, and so they become angry, but there's kind of like a cold hardness about it, and it can appear calculated, and then it can seem like it's not an overwhelming feeling, because actually there's something cold and hard happening, but it still comes from the same kind of place, that there's a hurt deep down,
Yes.
that somehow isn't seen.
Yeah, it's unlikely that everything that's happening in the response they bring into the world is intentional. I think it's mostly instinctual, isn't it?
Yeah.
They haven't learned to self-regulate because they lived in a very dysregulated environment. Most likely the dynamic in the family was as such, and they haven't learned to come in touch with themselves, to get closer to who they really are, to get to understand themselves. So it's kind of sad. And whatever we talk about now, I mean, in terms of their challenges, we see these challenges even out there in the other worlds. It's not just specific to inmates, I would think. Some of us probably have these responses sometimes, lashing out and doing things and, reacting rather than responding to life. But in your view, is the justice system really prepared to embrace a trauma-informed perspective and look at all of these people committing offenses as being children that have been exposed to a lot of adverse childhood experiences or abuse or neglect, and they haven't had the chance to heal or to grow into more mature or more adjusted individuals? What is your view on that?
Well, it's such a good question, because obviously there is a real trend at the moment for services of any sort, whether in prisons or not, to label themselves as trauma informed. But for me, I really see a trauma informed environment being about creating a place of safety that's nourishing and allows people to flourish and heal and grow. And I think there are lots of elements of the prison service that buck against that make that very, very difficult. And I think partly some of that is about the pressures from society. Prisons have to manage society's expectations that prison is punishment, and therefore it can't be seen to be too soft or compassionate or kind, even though if we want people to not commit crimes or not reoffend, we actually need the prisons to not be harsh. Deprivation of liberty is the punishment, and if you just think about that you lose the ability to walk on grass on a sunny day, you lose the ability to experience any kind of like kind touch from people, that's the punishment. But Joe Public kind of clamours for more than that, and I think prisons don't feel safe to the people in prison. So I think, one of the things I loved about the service that I ran was that we'd managed to create a community that was to some degree protected. So unusually, we had people who'd committed sexual offences living alongside people whose offences didn't include a sexual component. And most people knew what most other people had done. And that's really, really rare in prison, because people who've committed sexual offences are at risk of assault from others. And yet there was a safety about that. The fact that prisoners were talking about feeling loved and cared for. And there are other services in prison that I'm sure, if it's some of the therapeutic communities, for instance, like Grendon, I'm sure managed to create that sense of safety and belonging for people that are living there. But that's not the vast majority of people in prison. The vast majority of people in prison are living in circumstances where they're surrounded by people that they know have potentially done very bad, very dangerous things that they've no idea about whether the person is likely to do such a thing again. And when people don't feel safe, then they do things like make weapons, or they posture to make themselves seem more dangerous. So you get an escalation. And so I think without real investment in making sure that there are, that people do feel safe whilst they're in prison, actually, I think the chance of doing something trauma informed is very, very limited. If you don't feel safe, you can't learn, right? You need to feel safe enough to experiment, be curious, take measured risks in order to learn and grow, and you can't do that if you're not feeling safe.
Absolutely. You can't permit yourself to connect with others if you don't feel safe. So there's no way you can actually exchange anything with the world. So what can be done in your view to maybe change that and bring a bit more safety within the prison system?
Well, I think relational working is definitely the way forward in terms of, so the services like the defence unit was, therapeutic communities, they emphasise the need for the staff within the service to relate at a human level to the people in those services, and to help manage the relationships between the people that are living in those places. But unfortunately, austerity will put pressure to make services non-residential, so that there's a pressure for services to be outpatient, to work on an outpatient model whereby people come into the service to get their intervention and then go back to their living area. And all of that, actually the milieu is far more important than any psychological therapy. Living in a space where you feel safe, I would say, vastly outweighs any kind of, you could give somebody the best therapist and the best type of therapy in the world, but without all that surrounding stuff to help people really unfold and manage to experiment with being the person they were really meant to be when they were born. I think you're throwing your money away, really. And I also think we should be investing more in things like restorative justice, where people are made to take the emotional consequences of their actions. I think, we like to clamour for harsh punishments, like, there's an increasing trend towards much longer sentences, for instance. There's no evidence that longer sentences work.
Is the answer.
Yeah, but actually, so in the FENS unit, a similar thing was in the FENS unit. If somebody misbehaved, there would be a clamouring that the person should end up in the segregation unit. They had to see some harsh consequence as a consequence of misbehaving. But actually, what they didn't realise was quite often for the person who'd misbehaved, hearing from a staff member who they valued the relationship with, hearing that staff member say, actually, I feel really disappointed in you because you've behaved like this, I feel really let down, you've hurt me, I've put all this effort into supporting you, and now you've smashed up something, you've let yourself down, and that lets me down at the same time. And actually that was far more powerful as an intervention than taking the person down to segregation, where as soon as the door's unlocked and the team come to remove them and take them to segregation, they feel like the victim. So they lose sight of the fact the consequences related to their action. They just feel victimized.
Absolutely.
And restorative,
angrier and so on.
Exactly. And restorative justice builds on that in terms of, obviously, reparation with actual victims isn't always possible. Although sometimes victims don't want that, but when victims are able to engage with somebody who's been the victim, has been able to engage with something that's happened, actually there is evidence that offers an ability for the victim to gain closure and to be able to put things beyond them. And I would far rather see us work on that mindset of making people take emotional consequences for their actions. Same in Australia, there's some work with people who've engaged in domestic violence, where they go and live back in the community in which they engaged in their domestic violence, but they're doing it with having to take responsibility for their actions and having to build relationships. And Rob Canton from Loughborough University speaks of how this is like a parent, that when a parent scolds a child, it's the parent's job to make sure that the child still knows that they belong to the family and are still loved and accepted within the family. Whereas when you have people who are on the margins and you're telling them they're a really bad person and they don't belong and they don't deserve, you just harden that position on the outside. And if you're on the outside, you don't have a stake in society, so society's rules don't apply to you.
Yes, well, Yes, it makes sense. I mean, if the child has been punished, if you continue to punish them, what do you expect? What kind of response do you expect? Because you're reinforcing the same kind of, you know, treatment. And then what's the scope of keeping them physically isolated? You know, I think we need to rethink the justice system and the prison system, because you keep them physically there, but they, in their mind, they can continue to commit crimes all the time. They are free to do whatever they want. So which part of our lives, which part of our being do we actually engage with when we talk about, you know, justice and punishment and making someone responsible? I think what you're trying to do is the reconstruction of the human being when you work with people that are so harmed and, you know, so hurt inside. I don't know where you start, really, because it's very hard. I can understand why it takes 1 year just to build a therapeutic relationship where they feel you and they accept you around. And then they permit themselves to engage with others, with other inmates, and start building some relationships, because I don't think they are relationally attuned at all.
No, you're absolutely right, Nicoletta. Yeah. And I think, you know, people working in justice system often talk about the concept of old me versus new me. And actually, I don't find that very helpful, because that's almost like, let's throw that part to one side and let's build this new person. We would talk much more about finding the real you, the you that you were born to be, but actually had all this bad stuff happen to you, which distorted and didn't enable you to be at your healthiest. And treatment really should be about enabling you to find your true self and live that healthy, well self, rather than trying to artificially create somebody new that you don't need to. And I think that also removes that sense of blame. Obviously, people have to take responsibility for their actions as adults, but actually it's not their fault what happened to them prior to that. And there needs to be some help to, you know, some way to help them take stock of that and make choices going forward.
Yeah, if they don't understand their personal history, what happened before, you know, when they were little and they didn't have the tools to manage their own lives, you don't understand their life script, what happened before they were born in their ancestry, what's been given to them, really. I think it's going to make it very difficult for them to extract some meaning from their pain and from some meaning from the horrible acts that they've committed. If they came with a reason to teach them something, what was it about? How do you use this to move your life forward and create that change and transformation that you want to have in your life, to create that life that you want to have for yourself? Some of them, I think, based on my very, very little experience, they don't even believe that they deserve something. Their sense of self-worth is so low, so almost insignificant. I mean, they struggle to connect with that. There's very little self-esteem. There's very little confidence in their own abilities, because they've been squashed. You see, they've never been allowed to blossom and flourish. And this is what happens with us people. And that's why it's so important to become ourselves as parents really conscious about what good parenting is about. I made mistakes as a parent myself, although I looked at my parents and I would say when I was little, I will never do that. I will never be like this. You know, I would be,
like us all.
Yes, I'll be an extraordinary mother and I'll do this and that. And of course I did many of these, but I've also, you know, made some mistakes on the way, because when I wasn't myself conscious, so I wasn't there. I was operating from a, you know, database, from a memory kind of response, automatic.
But none of us are perfect, are we? And actually, we, you know, it's the Bowlbian quote of "you need a good enough parent," and you know, sadly, for the kind of people who end up in prison, they didn't have a good enough parent. But I perhaps just like to add one thing, because of knowing that, you know, knowing how people are when they hear about people's histories and that tendency to assume, you know, they're lying. I'd probably just like to add that for the men, they were far more comfortable talking about what they'd done than what had happened to them. That was a layer deeper into therapy, because they just accepted that as being that was kind of like normal parenting. Everybody they knew, you know, got beaten by their parents when they misbehaved, and they just saw that finding a way to avoid the paedophiles was part of what you had to do. A real, you know, there's a deep shame of admitting to being somebody whose parents couldn't love them enough to want to take care of them, and they would rather talk about committing a monstrous act and deal with the comeback from that than reveal the fact that they had been treated so badly as children.
Yes, it's unfortunate, but this is the reality of our lives. Transgenerational trauma, it's here, it's surrounding us, it's in us. We still don't talk about it. We still don't feel comfortable to open this big conversation. But I think things are shifting. I see there is an uprising in the level of consciousness. We have this Me Too movement. We had the Jimmy Savile here in England. So people are starting to talk about what's been happening to them, what they've seen happening. And this is very, very, very helpful for us as a modern society, moving into the digitalized world. You know, at least now we can do it, you know, before we get God knows where, in what kind of world. So how is life in captivity? Many of us haven't experienced that, although we can relate to being within a specific kind of environment that is somehow restrictive or oppressive. Is there room for happiness in that environment from what's been your learning?
I would say that there's moments of happiness. You know, I think you're obviously facing a lot more challenges to happiness in prison. Although you hear sometimes people like, I don't know if you know the footballer Jerry Barton, who spent time in prison, and he talks about embarking on a period of growth and discovery whilst he was in prison, that really using that. And so I think sometimes people try and take the meaning out of the situation and think, well, what can I do to make this an opportunity whilst I'm here? But there are moments of happiness, and we used to organise some events. We had a celebration of masculinity one year, and we had the Invictus athletes in. We had we had Laura Dodsworth, the filmmaker, in talking about her exhibition Manhood, and Justin Wiggins, a sound artist. And we did these kind of things, and the men would say at the end, they would all be very grateful and would say, thank you, that was the best day that we've had. It felt like I was outside having some freedom. For today, that people spoke to me, you know, people from outside came and spoke to me as if I was someone who was deserving of equal status. And that made them feel special and important. But also those senses of, you know, those moments of kindness within groups, when people reached out to one another and offered something really touching, and connection around again, kind of in the residential services, it's possible to do things like have community meals where people cook together, and food obviously is really important in terms of the symbolism around food and preparing food for one another. And so you do see moments of happiness in prison, but obviously there's a real challenge to happiness in an environment like that. And it's easy for some people to get caught up in the woe of the situation, staff as well as prisoners, actually. It's very easy to just get drawn into dwelling on the things that are challenging and miserable, and not look for the glint of sunshine and the hope that's there.
Well, we do it here as well, isn't it? We are in captivity, all of us, in a way or another, whether on a physical level, on a spiritual level, on a mental level. We experience that without doubt, I think, throughout life. So let's move the conversation nicely, although I would have loved to talk a little bit more about how can we help the inmates to remain open to happiness, to those little moments of joy, you know, that come unexpected sometimes. You just have to be open for it and just enjoy it and live it fully when it comes, without thinking too much about all of the other things, because they will still be there. I mean, the bars are still there. They don't go away. Why worry so much? You know, what's happening in the outside world will always unfold anyway, without you being there.
Mm.
But of course, it's easy when we talk from this side of the fence. Yeah. I'm quite understanding and respectful towards what they go through. But now let's shift the conversation. Let's move it to the captivity in the outside world, not within the prison system. Are we really captive? Do you feel like, without doubt, we get ourselves trapped into all sorts of different places that rob us from freedom? What is really freedom? Because you use this word and I think it's so powerful.
That's a really good question, but again, another big one. I think there's something about choosing to take control over your own destiny, actually, and your own life. So I think, during the course of the pandemic, I found myself with so much more time, as we all did, and could have got caught up in feeling miserable about that, how shrunken our worlds were. But for me, I kind of thought I need to try and make this an opportunity to how can I make something of this, in terms of it's an opportunity that's not going to present itself again. So really throwing myself into things that I like doing anyway, like yoga and mindfulness, meditation, all that kind of thing. But that's the kind of thing that would get squeezed out of my day ordinarily. And here I was, I've got loads more time, so actually let's make use of the time, going for lovely big long walks. Again, I would, that's the sort of thing I would have always loved to have done, but didn't have time to. And then also started the podcast, which was out of that wish to try and create some positive moments. So
you mentioned about the podcast. Let's talk a little bit about the podcast. So Locked Up Living podcast, it started right after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, isn't it?
Yes. So we started having discussions in July 2020,
right.
August 2020. My co-host David Jones, who's a forensic psychotherapist, I didn't really know him before. We were in contact, having discussions about whether I had some resources that I could share with him for prisoners in other parts of the prison system, that they could, because the prisoners moved to a system where they were locked up for almost all day, every day. So almost like conditions of segregation. So we started having conversations to do with sharing resources. And then we ended up talking about how lots of people that work in the criminal justice system end up quite jaded and cynical about human nature.
Right.
And how do you hold on to the positive side of life and remain upbeat and not get drawn into being cynical? And it started off an idea that we would perhaps try and take over an issue of the Prison Service Journal, and have a number of articles within there. And then we spoke to a journalist friend of David's who said, why don't you do a podcast? And we were like, oh, we've never done this before, but I suppose we both liked the idea of the challenge. It was a new opportunity to do something different. So podcasting is totally new to me, and I'm actually an introvert. So putting my voice out there can feel a little bit, or certainly felt very overwhelming. The very first trailer that we put up, I was like, God, I really want to take that down. I was cringing with embarrassment. And if it had just been me, it probably would have been taken down. But the thing that draws our guests together is that what we're trying to do is identify, it's called Locked Up Living for a reason, and that being locked up doesn't have to mean the end of your life, and actually living is something different to existing. And so our guests are people who have something to share, sometimes on what some of the barriers to wellbeing are in organisations. And we're obviously particularly concerned with the justice system because we've spent a long time working in various institutions that come under the auspices of the criminal justice system. But also we've interviewed people about boarding school, compassion in August. So we look at challenges to wellbeing as well as ways to overcome challenges. So in addition to boarding school, we've looked at the police, we've had Michael West on talking about compassion in the NHS, Justin Wiggins talking about the use, how sound is therapeutic and can enrich your life. And, you know, if you start thinking about organizations and institutions, you know, you start with the prison system, but our family is an institution, society, education, really you can go as big as you like. We try and maintain a reasonable balance of guests that are drawn from forensic work, but I genuinely believe you get a richer experience by listening to stories from other parts of life. So it's been important to me to keep having guests on from different areas, which is why I'm hoping that you will guest very shortly, Nicoletta.
With pleasure, sure. Why not? So you're running this podcast. What's your taking from this? Let's say a year and a half later. What's brought into your life? What did you learn?
It's brought me a lot of happiness, actually. It's brought me, I feel like I've had my own personal CPD program in operation for the last 18 months. I've had amazing conversations with really lovely people. You know, everyone who's been on has been very passionate about their area, really nice and generous in terms of giving us their time to talk. But I've also learned about some really interesting areas of work. Had conversations with people who, and who've been amazing in terms of their endeavours, and a lot of people doing really good things that come from a really good place as well, which gives you a really strong sense of the good in humanity, to hear about these pieces of work.
Amazing. So the solution for you to open to happiness is to start a podcast then.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh God, it sounds so lovely. Cool. So now towards the end, Naomi, I would talk to you all day. I mean, until late in the evening, but we'll do it again. I'm sure of that. Can we share with the listeners and the watchers your best 2 or 3 tips to remain open whilst in captivity? Any type of captivity?
I think it has to be that to take the situation and make it an opportunity. So it might feel like you have nothing or you've lost everything, but actually there is always something there that you have. So for people in prison, for instance, what they have that other people don't have is they have masses and masses of time. So they can make use of that time.
Yes.
And no matter where you are, no matter what your circumstances, there will be something that there is something there that you can take and make an opportunity. So I suppose that would be my number one takeaway from that. And then I also think kind of like use your gut more and look to what draws you towards it in a positive way. And your gut needs feeding, yeah. So head for the things that really ignite you and make you feel passionate, and follow those.
So beautiful. I think what you're talking about is use the resources that you have. Don't look somewhere else. Don't crave for something that is not given to you right now. Maybe it will be at some point. Maybe you're not ready for that. Maybe you have to be here for a reason. So stay attuned to your circumstances and take the resources that you have and make the best of this beautiful moment that is just going. You see, you can't catch it. It's always going, becoming past, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I probably would just add one thing to that, because obviously we all have our ups and downs. I'm, perhaps making myself sound like some Pollyanna paragon of virtue, which isn't me at all. But there is something about actually every day is a fresh day. So you have a bad day and you get drawn into, feeling crap about the situation you're in, but actually you get up and it's a fresh day and start that fresh day from a different mindset.
So powerful. A big thanks to all of you watching and listening, and many, many thanks to you, Naomi, for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
You're very welcome. That's it for now. Until next time, we are wishing you all good health and happiness.